Hello again, emerging cricket fans. Another big show and a huge guest this week. But before we jump in, a shout out to those who support us on Patreon. From as little as $2 US a month as a patron, you can access bonus content at Emerging Cricket and have a say on the show's direction. To sign up, log on to Patreon. That's patreon.com/emerging cricket. On today's show, we sit down with author, journalist, and Australian Media Hall of Fame inductee Gideon Haigh to discuss a range of issues in the game. You don't want to miss this one. Hello and welcome to another Emerging Cricket podcast online and on Sport FM in Perth. I'm Daniel Beswick. Tim Culler and Nick Skinner will join me in a few moments' time when we chat to Gideon Haigh in a bumper extended show. But first, some news from around the emerging cricket world. A rescheduled structure for the 2022 T20 World Cup in Australia headlines a number of ICC announcements this week. 67 associate members will compete in regional qualifying to begin, with Nepal, UAE and Singapore already locked in to the global qualifier stage. The global qualifier will split from its previous 16-team tournament to two 8-team qualifiers, with 2 teams of each of those qualifiers progressing to the World Cup in October 2022. Meanwhile, announcements have been made in regards to the 2023 Men's Cricket World Cup and the 2022 Women's Cricket World Cup. Cricket World Cup League 2 will now resume on the 19th of March when Oman host USA and Nepal, while PNG are slated to host 2 series across April and May. As for the Challenge League below, action will begin in August. On the women's side, a day-night final on April 3, 2022 headlines the full schedule for the Women's World Cup. 3 qualifiers will emerge from the global qualifier from the 26th of June in Sri Lanka. Dav Watmore has been announced as the new head coach of the Nepali men's national team. Watmore was Sri Lanka's head coach in their 1996 World Cup winning campaign and has associate experience through coaching Singapore. And finally, the Netherlands have outlined plans for ICC full membership by 2025-26 after their winter general meeting, with potential decoupling of test status and full membership. Playing test matches are not on the agenda, though a governance committee has been appointed to review the viability of the project. That's all the news in the emerging game this week. For more, make sure to log on to emergingcricket.com. But up next, Gideon Haigh.
Ciao ragazzi, sono Fabio Marabini della Federazione Cricket Italiana e benvenuti all'Emerging Cricket Podcast.
Well, the all-star guest list here on the Emerging Cricket Podcast has yet another member. Tim, Nick, the usual welcome, please.
Ooh.
An Australian Media Hall of Fame inductee, journalist and author, senior cricket writer at The Australian, Gideon Haigh. Gideon, welcome to the Emerging Cricket Podcast.
Nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on, and as I said before we started, I'll give you a nice full toss outside off stump to start with. As we come towards the end of the year and reflect, I suppose, on the difficulties, you've made the point in a lot of your writing that when discussing the game's troubles this year, the issues weren't brought upon necessarily by COVID, but were simply pre-existing issues that have only been exposed further.
Sure.
How do you assess the game, I suppose, in its entirety in 2020 and the way that it's dealt with COVID amongst other troubles?
Well, one of the words that comes to mind is disjointed. You know, it's demonstrated, just how far apart countries are and the lack of kind of any sort of central organising proposition. Everyone has kind of solved their problems according to their own lights. There's been, I think, relatively little sense of a common wheel. Certainly England did set a good example, that Pakistan and the West Indies tours going ahead there, and Australia fulfilling its ODI obligations. But cricket's been dormant in a lot of other places, and there's been a sense of people trying to solve things on the hop with short-term ambitions in mind, just trying to kind of get through the day. Sorry, something's just happened there in front of me. I've managed to detour into Adobe Flash Player. I've got about 57 windows open on my screen at the moment. I'll find my way back to you presently. But it's been remarkable, considering that this is a global issue, just how absent the ICC has been. The ICC's been obsessed with its own governance and trying to elect a chairman, and it's astonishing that should take 6 months in what's ostensibly a well-organised professional organisation. And it's remarkable that no one felt that this was particularly important. Cricket's become so used to localised solutions and to national sovereignties that it seems to have less of a sense of an overarching strategy than it ever has before, and that is obviously reflected in the area where you're involved. Associates cricket has really languished this year, and we all know that it's got relatively shallow roots in a lot of the places where it's ostensibly established, and a year of neglect can do a lot of damage. So it's been kind of disquieting. I think people are desperate to put 2020 behind them in all sorts of respects, both cricket and non-cricket, but it hasn't been a good advertisement for a game that preens itself as a global endeavour.
Speaking of it being a global endeavour, we had an associate as interim chair, and we now have, well, the former chair of New Zealand is now the independent chair. I think we still find that concept bizarre, how someone can step out of one chair and step from being there carrying the interests of their country to then put it down and then move one chair around to be independent. How do you see that? You said that it didn't seem to seem how important it was. We now have an independent chair. Shashank Manohar, I think, did a great job in terms of trying to push back against some of the bigger powers in the game for game's sake. But we now have a chair that's come in with the backing of the big three and heavy backing against, well, the incumbent from Singapore, Imran Khawaja, who had the backing of, reportedly the independent director across the board. How do you see this affecting cricket going forward?
Well, I think one of the reasons why Manohar was a slightly more effective ICC leader than we've become accustomed to is because India was so weak and divided after the Lodha Commission reforms. India was obsessed with fixing its own household and perhaps didn't have as much time as it has previously to dominating affairs at ICC. That hiatus has ended now. The establishment in India has been able to see off the reforming zeal of the Supreme Court, and it's pretty much business as usual, perhaps even worse than usual, because the BJP has got its hooks into cricket now in a pretty big way, and I have dire forebodings about the living out of political agendas in Indian cricket.
How do you see that manifesting? I think I think your political. There's the China, India, Pakistan. Cricket looking to break out of its sort of colonial roots and what that means for countries sort of getting their own back. How do you see that manifesting for cricket?
Well, India's priorities are about exploiting its own domestic market and using its global clout to influence affairs. I think that we're likely to see more activity within India than outside it over the next few years. And I think there is an every man for himself ethos that prevails at ICC level. The tone being set by the big three, so we're likely to see more short-term expedience and less of a sense of common purpose. It's still far from clear to me what cricket's global strategy is. They've spent years talking about rolling out some sort of set of overarching principles, but they can't even seem to agree on that. So eventually, the leadership vacuum had some positive outcomes in the sense that some things were accomplished that probably wouldn't otherwise have been possible in the last few years. But I think that period is coming to an end. And I don't see much incentive for anyone to kind of confront that kind of strategic inertia.
We have gone heavy into the governance here. I think we could have had...
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's good. I like it.
Would you like me to tell a few jokes?
No. That is absolutely, completely my fault. But people keep listening, so so it's one of those things that I think Dan Brettig's always good to get his teeth into some of these things. But you don't see too many other people really getting into it about governance and structure. To your point of what is the game's global strategy. I think that's we can put things in nice columns and talk about that. But I guess from our point of view, looking at it, it's about growing the game, and is cricket doing that, and how is it? I think your quote, and I don't want to steal the questions that Nick has diligently put together already, but from Death of a Gentleman about, does cricket exist to make money, or is it is the money there to actually run cricket? It's a tough question, and even tougher in countries where event results can determine the future of the game in associate nations. And I think that's no more evident now with the talk of changes again to World Cups or having fewer events and still having smaller events, and still the money that needs to be relied on for that coming through global events, all the other opportunities, will cricket be in the Olympics, etc. But we'll get to that. But Could Imran Khawaja have worked as ICC chair?
I think the unfortunate and unpalatable reality is that one of the reasons why he was able to occupy that seat for so long was because it's not a very important seat, frankly. If it was an important seat, more covetous eyes on it than there were. I got a lot of respect for Khawaja, and I did think it would be, in an ideal world, the idea of an experienced associate administrator take reign there would have been a very positive step. But I feel as though it happened for kind of negative reasons, that it was in no one's particular interest to grasp that nettle. And in some ways, Barclay is a compromise candidate as well. He's made a few positive sounds since his appointment, but it's a bit hard to work out how he's going to engineer any of these positive outcomes. Everything will have the BCCI's right of veto written all over it. And, it's like I was saying at the weekend, where does an 800-pound gorilla sit? Anywhere he likes.
Doesn't have to be in the corner of the room, absolutely.
No.
Just looking a bit more generally at the idea of governance at the ICC and of course even national board levels. We've seen Cricket South Africa implode. Zimbabwe has been a bit of a disaster for quite a while now, and that's not to mention several other notorious boards as well. What do you think makes good governance or good administration, and what systems should we, as advocates for the emerging game, try to look for to improve the standards of governance in cricket? One of the things I've thought of is at least stuff like freedom of information access, because currently there's so much secrecy around everything.
It is an astonishing amount of secrecy. I completely agree. And it's secrecy just partly because no one's ever been previously interested in it. I mean, just to go back a step, we talk about this issue about cricket's kind of existential purpose. This was never something we really had to worry about. There was never very much money in cricket. Money has come to cricket really only in the last generation. We never had to worry about the distribution of huge surpluses. There was always just enough money to keep the lights on and to keep the game ticking over. So in some respects, the administration of cricket is very inexperienced in dealing with vast sums of money and is vulnerable, I think, to charlatans who come along saying that they know what to do about it, and has fallen in very easily with the idea that it's very important to have people who understand business on boards rather than people who like cricket or people who have an interest in the philosophy of cricket, who have a genuine passion for taking it to new frontiers. The difficulty, I think, is always going to be finding people who are both genuinely passionate and also disinterested, people who are excited about the game and what they can do for the game rather than what the game can do for them. The point you make about information, I think, is fundamental. I'd like, as a basic minimum requirement of national boards, I think board minutes should be published as much as possible. Disclosure requirements in cricket are absolutely risible. I'd like to see executive salaries disclosed. It's strange. Cricket's acquired many of the appurtenances of the corporate world, but none of its obligations. And I fear that, a lot of these organisations are in the process of being politically subverted, including the BCCI now. That might be happening before our very eyes. And we've got virtually no way of finding out what's going on the inside of these organisations. BCCI doesn't even have an external affairs department. You often see a BCCI spokesman quoted, but we've got no idea who they are. There are no formal reporting structures. It seems to run on kind of rumour and innuendo and groupthink. And that's just not good enough. But it's difficult to see how you exercise any kind of external pressure on these organisations in order to engineer reform.
Well, there's a brilliant article that you wrote around the time of the Big Three takeover that I remember reading, and I recently reread it, and there's some really good quotes from it. It's called "The Men Who Sold the World," basically just talking about all the behind-the-scenes shenanigans. Do you think part of the reason that all of this stuff can happen is because of that secrecy we just talked about, or do you think, 100 years ago, it was men in egg and bacon suits sitting in a smoky room in London, and there was still no accountability.
But it didn't matter quite so much because you didn't have a huge boodle to lose. Part of the problem is that the status of these organisations is ambiguous. They're non-profit organisations with tax-free status that are nonetheless geared to generating, in certain cases, huge surpluses. And I think that attracts disturbing degrees of kind of low-level grifting below the attention of regulators. Not that there are any real regulators out there, that are too really small to detain the media, and that these behaviours become disturbingly normalised. People go, oh, it's only a game, it's all fun, and why shouldn't we help ourselves? We're good people, we've got the interests of the game at heart. And executives become overmighty in those structures because the boards are so supine. They're basically supervisory boards. They're rubber stamps for ready-made strategies. And the casual assumption is that the organisations themselves embody cricket, so that it's in their commercial interest is the interest of the game. The game has almost ceased to have any existence outside that which is officially run. So, how do we know when things are going well? I guess we cleave towards commercial outcomes, on-field performances. And there's an assumption, a general assumption that over time these will broadly align. But I think often the main driver of the structure of who's successful in international cricket is GDP, size and vitality of the domestic economy. The rise of Indian cricket doesn't really reflects sort of Indian virtue or Indian prowess. It reflects the scope and the scale of resources that are available to Indian cricket. And the regression of West Indian cricket, probably at the same time, is about the economic challenges that over time that team was for a period able to defy. But over the journey, things revert to the mean.
So I guess this whole situation, it's a Gordian knot, really. So who's going to be the Alexander to just cut through it all, or will there even be someone who is able to manage that?
Well, often it takes a crisis to bring about change, and cricket has been historically quite good at staving off crises, at finding kind of interim solutions and getting by. And also the attention of the public is focused on the next game, and the attention of the players is focused on the next contract. Cricket's a game of instants, isn't it? It's a succession of instants. The idea of us thinking forward 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the track doesn't come naturally in a game, even with the sometimes sort of geological timescales of cricket relative to other games. So it would probably take, it might take something like the collapse of a major country, like South Africa, actually, to stimulate some sense of global interdependence, because it's in no one's interests for South African cricket to go to the wall. And yet there is a kind of a case now for a sort of an external intervention in the affairs of Cricket South Africa. It's got to a state where the game is almost incapable of running itself.
Well, yeah, looking at South Africa, they have their own problems, but to look at some of the other four members outside of the big three, and Sri Lanka are teetering in terms of financial trouble and their own situation, but it all comes back to this conversation of the big three and the sharing of the financial pot, making it so difficult for those outside. And even to think in any other sport that say, for instance, the top 10, top 12 countries in the world, that say 8 or 9 of them find themselves under financial hardship. Many of them can't host test series without profiting from them. What's the alternative here? Because as you said, it looks as if it needs an external intervention, to use, your own words there, for something to happen. But just how will that happen? Will it take something like South Africa to die off again?
It's quite possible, and for a major tour not to be able to take place, or a global event to go ahead without a major country, that would be mortifying for international cricket. But it's perfectly conceivable. Actually, it's been perfectly conceivable for the last 5 years. Frankly, I'm surprised that some of these countries have gotten as far as they have. Sri Lankan cricket always seems to be on the precipice, doesn't it? And somehow, maybe in some ways, COVID has slowed that process down, because it's actually the losses that are sustained in the course of hosting international tours in Sri Lanka haven't been sustained. The can has been kicked further down the road. But as a result of what's happened in the last year, all the countries are going to be weaker, and that step closer to a terminal event. So this is becoming a very apocalyptic podcast. I didn't intend it to be that way. Let me on.
I think deep down it always kind of is. It's just we are positive about the outlook of emerging cricket, but unfortunately, the overlords make it tricky at times.
I'm looking for the happy ending to this podcast. Looking down the other questions is like, stick around, guys. I think it's got time for group hugs. I think to get...
Look, the positive thing to say about the game, and I constantly have to reinforce, is it's the best game.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's just a bloody brilliant game, and I'm reminded of that every weekend when I play it. I'm reminded of how much love that the game engenders, how much enthusiasm, how much selflessness, how much decency, how full of good people cricket is. And that's, something I find infinitely restorative. I'm not sure I'd feel quite so optimistic about cricket if I didn't actually play it at a club that I love.
That's an interesting point, actually, because I remember speaking a couple of years ago to someone who was sort of disillusioned. I think there was some match fixing stuff coming out, and my response was that it's not professional players who are taking grubby bribes or whatever. It's you and it's me and it's the guys on the street or the players in Kabul who have to pick out landmines from their cricket field or the beach in Sri Lanka. That's cricket, and it's not all these administrative games. But that's the great frustration for me, is that the administrative games affect everything so far down the chain, and nobody down the chain has any real say in any of those games, and there's just so little accountability.
Yeah, that's true. But we must reflect that international cricket, while it's watched by many people, involves relatively few. A relatively small part of cricket's population. And, it's not like my teammates and I sit around at the end of a day's play worrying about the ICC's global strategy. At the moment, I'm trying to find 15 cricketers for the weekend. I've struck out completely today. I'm going to have to start again tomorrow.
Well, Bez is flying down to Melbourne soon, aren't you?
Bez?
I don't know how available I'm going to be for some club cricket, unfortunately. I'm a reliable top order batsman, but the shorter formats, you're probably not looking at the right person for the job. But in terms of cricket is... As you say, it's a wonderful game, and it's also a very flexible game. We've got 3 formats at the international level. We have, the likes of T10 cricket, which has worked in several demographics and several markets. Is there almost an inferiority complex the ICC and cricket almost has with itself sometimes, where it almost feels like the game's too complicated perhaps to introduce to new people? There often just seems to be this strange idea from the power brokers in the game, even, some of the people, high up involved in the game, that just simply think that the game isn't able to progress. We've seen the evolution of cricket since the game started.
Yeah, there are all sorts of contradictions about this, isn't there? One of the first questions that a new potential fan would ask is, who's the world champion? But who is the world champion? I don't know. And what format do we decide it in? That would normally be, in football, it's the World Cup winner. But one-day international cricket isn't even on free-to-air television in Australia. Now, between World Cups, we don't care about it. So cricket is very confused about what it is. There's no doubt about that. That has opportunities, and its capacity, its flexibility, as you say, is actually quite prodigious. A lot of things are identifiable as cricket that come in multifarious forms. But I do feel as though there has now to be a period of consolidation, or at least an agreement about hierarchies in cricket, so that we can answer those fundamental questions to new markets. There are high barriers to entry to understanding in cricket for the lay fan. Once we've got them in the tent, it's great. That complexity is kind of exciting and endlessly rejuvenating. But getting people through the door is a challenge for cricket, because some of those fundamental questions haven't been resolved.
So you threw it out there. If you had that big stick about making the hierarchy simpler to make it easier to the new fan, what do you do?
Oh God, something completely impractical, like pool all bilateral revenues and have a full-fledged Test championship.
Well, that sounds good.
That'd do me, but it's not going to happen, is it? Not going to happen.
I'd love to see that.
It's a beaubeautiful dream.
It's a beautiful dream.
I don't want to start crying on a podcast, but it is enough to bring tears to one's eyes. Just thinking, imagine that. It's so simple. It would work, but that would mean certain nations giving up $400 million a year of income. I know that's the total amount, but when we even start looking at the distribution of pie, of cash around to the full members, not included in that is the income they get from hosting these global events that they gave themselves as well. And look, those who host events should benefit, but not to the exclusion of everyone else. It's one thing, the direct distributions, but when you keep all ticket revenue and various other things connected to an event like that, and all the flow-on effects as well, it brings water to the eyes for other reasons, doesn't it?
Oh, exactly. It's just another way of the money being sucked up, isn't it?
Because again, who do those global events belong to? Explaining that to people as well. When people say, "Oh, well, it's India," that is bringing that money. It's like, no, it's a TV channel, giving money to a global event, and understanding how that comes, which is now owned 100% by Disney, which is also an interesting perspective there to see how the future bears for the old Star, Fox, now under the Disney brand, and what that means against Comcast. Anyway, that's another podcast itself. But Bez, I think what are you thinking about the complexity and the inferiority complex of cricket there? I know you've got a question there.
Well, this is probably a bit more self-indulgent than anything else, but we've seen the advent of T20 international status be opened up to every single ICC member. One-day international status now for 20 members. Full membership, as we know, in the 12. Therein lies another complexity when talking about T20 international cricket, and I think the big important thing for me is that for a Romanian or for a Brazilian or for a Canadian, a performance at T20 international level, if it's a significant one, will be reflected in the record books, and it's a discussion that we see a lot in terms of stats and status and things like that. I feel like you're pretty well positioned to talk about this, but do you think something is as trivial as trivia in terms of stats and statistics and having, perhaps, some of the more unconventional cricketing countries on that list is another way to inspire certain pockets of the world about, our great game?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a natural expansion vehicle, isn't it? T20 cricket, and it's had that written all over it, which one of the paradoxes of that is that among the major nations, T20 international cricket between T20 World Cups is an add-on to schedules, isn't it? And often regarded as a bit of a nuisance for players. It's an opportunity to rest your key players. In fact, that's what we've seen in Australia just recently. I've actually always been a bit of a fan of T20 international cricket, which makes me kind of a bit at odds with a lot of thinkers on the game who think that T20 should be primarily a domestic game. But I don't think that a vehicle as potent as T20 cricket shouldn't have its opportunity to show its international potential. I know that the calendar's a total mess, and I know that it's global events that attract eyeballs. But a T20 international series between Afghanistan and Ireland is significant, precisely because there may not be any other opportunity for those two countries to get together in another genre, in another format. These things may not matter to us, but they matter a great deal to other people.
Well, they have the ODI Super League penciled in for early next year. And as you said, with the calendar being the way it is, it's meant that it's potentially the BBL's loss if a number of Afghan players do go over and play in that series. Whether that goes ahead or not, we're yet to see. But I suppose that kind of leads to another question, being that what's the solution in terms of having, say, international windows for cricket and having domestic windows where the players can make, a significant amount of money, which they deserve as professional athletes, ultimately to come back to play international cricket, but to not have that trouble of scheduling. What's the solution there?
Well, the solution, whether we like it or not, is going to be market forces, isn't it? What competitions prosper and what go by the board. Eventually, I think that a lot of these domestic T20 competitions are defying gravity. People are chucking money in them in the hope of making a bean. They'll probably extract their rents in other ways, but ultimately, these things have to pay their way. And I think global boards are hoping that their competitions are among the last ones standing once a shakeout takes place. I'll be interested to see what impact a significant global recession has on the cricket economy. That's potentially a bit of a shakeout. We saw a shakeout in T20 cricket back in 2008 after the global financial crisis, didn't we? Alan Stanford went to the wall. The Indian Super League fell apart. The Big Bash plans were deferred at the time. This will be worse. and the effects potentially that much more drastic.
I'm interested to kind of hear about the comparisons maybe with cricket and its pay issues and franchise leagues as a comparison to, say, World Series cricket. I know you've written, quite markedly about World Series cricket. Were there any things we learnt from that era when applying our ideas to the advent of franchise cricket?
What we learned primarily in 77 to 79 is that cricket has a broadcast value. And if you don't exploit it, then someone else will. What was possible for Kerry Packer in 1977 was a huge arbitrage. Cricket was being sold at something grossly beneath its market value because there'd never been any particular need to maximise its profitability. And, Packer saw that opportunity opening up, and like a good businessman, he seized it, and he basically maintained it for the next 15 years. Kerry Packer's success was not merely in the first 2 years of World Series cricket; it was in the next 15 years where he basically was this giant hegemon in Australia, almost running the game by default by the amounts of money that he grudged the Australian Cricket Board. He made a handful of players quite wealthy and kept the rest of the game relatively poor. I don't think any broadcaster will enjoy that level of control over cricket's destiny as Packer did. The cricket was just uniquely unprepared for dealing with a corporate buccaneer as rapacious and ruthless as Packer. But that learning that if you don't exploit it, someone else will, is one that's been on administrators' minds ever since. That's one of the reasons, I think, for the sort of the weird entrepreneurial zeal that pertains in certain international boards. When Lalit Modi created the Indian Premier League, he specifically invoked the example of Kerry Packer. He wanted to be the Kerry Packer to Indian cricket, and the opportunity existed, and he also seized it. But the BCCI got sick and tired of him seizing it, and they seized it back.
Is it time for an emerging cricket or an international cricket Robin Hood to come and save it?
Yeah, good luck with that. Who's it going to be? Is it going to be Tim Cutler?
How are those shares cuts?
Is this where the revolution begins in this podcast?
They've all got to start somewhere.
We've all got to start somewhere.
We need more patrons.
We need more. It's okay. Gideon, we'll get you to record a few endorsements at the end of this we can use to kind of put on. You talk about the ACB now CA and the struggles they're going through, the 7 Fox, Channel 10. And I don't know if you'd seen it, that the ICC's put out an RFP for broadcast and commercial rights for all of their pathway events. So all the Cricket World Cup League 2, Challenge League and qualifying events for the first time ever, basically telling us that they'll all be streamed. They all weren't in the past, or at least they didn't have anything structured. So the ICC is looking to that as well. But I kind of reflecting, you're talking about the T20 events and people kind of trying to make money from that as well. We're seeing some people make money and a lot of people not make money, do we? In this new world, it's a tough one. We've got, on one hand, we've got, ICC making money from white ball events that's being used to subsidise Test cricket. And have we built a system that's basically breaking? That's what's the way forward from this in terms of global events and these local, you talk about the BCCI and how they've turned the IPL into one of the most valuable sporting franchise events in the world, or per game. I think it's up there with some of the American leagues. But the money's caused the problems, but where to for the game? How do we get out of this?
Well, we need a model that's more profoundly redistributive, don't we? We have lots of money. It's just concentrated in certain spots and has no way of reaching the parts that need it. So cricket's never been wealthier in some places and seldom poorer in others. And you make the point there about the streaming of associates cricket, which is in one respect a boon, but also raises hideous issues around security and potential malpractice, because these are the games and these are the formats and these are the players who are most vulnerable to illegal inducements. I don't think anyone's even begun to conjure with that idea. Periodically, one reads that the ICC's rubbed out X from X country, and we all go back to normal, and we take it for granted that the game is being protected. But I suspect that that's merely the tip of the iceberg as far as malpractice is concerned, because it's in no one's interest to look all that closely at what's going on. not the ICC, not the associates, not the players. And sunlight's the best disinfectant, but who's going to pay for the sunlight?
Well, this leads to another question. Whose interest is it in to be shining a light on these things? And this raises some questions around sports journalism more generally, in that, on the one hand, you're trying to have some level of accountability, but on the other hand, it's hard not to get chummy with your subjects, i.e., the players. And then as well, there's the question of bringing down a sports team with some explosive reporting. That damages the brand of the sport, which isn't necessarily good for a sport-based journalist. Yeah. Whereas, if you're a political reporter and you find some big scandal, well, that's great for you. So what's the, where is the interest in journalism in sports, and is it too cozy with the sport itself?
Well, and of course, the journalists are often part of major media organisations that also other parts of which own broadcast rights and have an interest in publicising the game. So,
well, 50% of the people on this call are, aren't they?
No comment.
Well, look, I can only tell you how I kind of solve it, or I address it. I'm interested in the players, but I'm not obsessed with them. I don't really want to be chummy with them. I think that makes life potentially quite difficult. The only time I ever felt that kind of emotional pull where a player was concerned was when I was reporting test matches involving Ed Cowan, who happens to be a good friend of mine. And I can tell you, I was almost glad when Ed retired, because I was happy to put that emotional ordeal behind me. But the players are temporary and the game is abiding. I write about the players with respect and simpatico, because we both love the same thing, but not with an expectation that we have a great deal in common. I think that you just simply have to be skeptical and independent where the game is concerned, and to have something like the idea of the game's best interests at heart, however you choose to define that. I think that one of the problems is that, as it is for the players, is that journalists become financially dependent on the game, and it becomes difficult for them to have that kind of independent outlook. So I've always tried to have the attitude that I'm kind of an amateur cricket journalist. I'm a professional journalist, but an amateur cricket journalist. I'm just I'm visiting because I like the game and I wish it well, but I've no desire to become part of the industry or to build my own franchise in it. Not on social media, not really interested in television. I like playing it and I enjoy writing about it and I enjoy watching it. If for some reason I couldn't do it tomorrow, that'd be okay. I'd move on to something else. My life's not so interpenetrated with cricket that I can't live without it. And I think that's not a bad perspective to have.
Well, you do have about 100 Wisdens stacked up behind you.
A misspent youth. Yeah, there's a big intellectual investment in cricket, that's for sure, and that's actually what makes it rewarding to write about. Having spent a lot of time studying its history and getting to know its culture and experiencing it in different places and watching a lot of it. I think the more you put in, the more you get out, that's for sure. But you also should be capable of taking a step back from it and doing something else. I think that enriches the experience, going away from it for a while and coming back to it. You return refreshed and you see things with clearer eyes. Certainly when the cricket season ends, I'm well and truly ready to think about something else and have no trouble in detaching from cricket and finding other gainful ways to spend my time.
So what do you do when you're not doing cricket, Gideon? That's I feel like I only ever see you in a cricket context.
Yeah, well, I've written 41 books, Nick, and I think probably 25 of those are cricket. But I also write about business. My background is as a business journalist.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah, I've written books about true crime. I've written books about social policy. I've written a 200,000-word synoptic history of The Office, which was great fun. Really enjoyed it. I've written a lot of long-form journalism for various publications, which have had nothing to do with cricket. Cricket's a wonderful way to meet people and to find common ground with people. It gives you a kind of an instantaneous understanding, a shared kind of heritage. But there are people out there who have absolutely no idea that I write about cricket, including some of the people at my own club. A few years ago, a guy was driving me home from Como Park and he said, it's funny you've got the same name as that journalist. I went, yeah. Funny that, yeah.
Isn't it?
There can't be too many around.
Now, when the history of The Office, you're talking about the actual, like, working in an office?
Yeah.
Okay, not the television show. Okay.
No, not the television show. I couldn't have got 200,000 words of that.
That would have been right down my alley. Then I would start quoting at you, and then I'm glad I asked the question.
Actually, it's here. It's sitting on my desk. There it is. The Office, a hard-working history.
That's hefty.
Not printed by Dunder Mifflin, Tim.
No. But yeah, I mean, I've never really regarded myself as a cricket journalist. I'm a journalist who writes about cricket and who doesn't write about cricket.
But that is important too, because it means that you can, as you said, detach yourself from the game, but also, again, something you brought up, you come in with a fresh pair of eyes. I think it's quite relatable at the end of the cricket season. You know, the last thing I want to think about is cricket, and I dive into something else, just probably for my own well-being, if anything. But yeah, you would agree that it's very important for your well-being to kind of give yourself that time and to kind of put cricket in the context of everything else in life. And then when it comes to that point to dive into it again, you do feel refreshed, but ultimately you know what your purpose is and what you can get out of it and how important it is to, I don't know, people around who read your work perhaps.
You also, I mean, CLR James gave us the timeless admonition, didn't he? What do they know of cricket who only cricket know? Sometimes we're in danger of just taking it way too seriously. You know, it's meant to be enjoyed. It's meant to be a pleasure. It's meant to give people excitement and joy and to uplift them. It's not meant to be an industry. I hate it when people talk about the cricket industry and people who talk about the business. At Cricket Australia, apparently, it's customary for people to talk about the business. That's just anathema to me. It's a game, and that's what it should stay. I'm not interested in going to watch a business. I'm interested in going to watch a game and play a game. I understand that it's important that the game have an economic kind of undergirding, but I don't want that to be its paramount purpose. There's enough business in my life. There's enough politics in my life without cricket adding to it.
It's interesting though, because I'm sure Cricket Australia and a number of boards around the world, both full member and associate, need to almost think of it in some ways as a business to make sure that they keep their own jobs and they fulfill their own duties as part of these organisations to make sure they're financially sustainable.
Yeah, look, it shouldn't be that difficult, should it? Really? You know, to keep it going, as long as there's enough in the kitty. It's not that difficult to run my club, you know, as long as there's enough money to keep us on the field and for, you know, reserves for maybe a year if something untoward takes place. I think we're often in danger of overcomplicating it. And the stakeholders, because there are multiple stakeholders pulling it in different directions because of an absence of any kind of sense of overarching purpose.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I just think that sometimes, you know, Cricket Australia at some point probably a bit too much off that they could chew. And if they put, you know, for instance, a lot of money into the stock market and then, you know, we had COVID and things happened there and people were made redundant, I'm kind of fascinated by, you know, what that entire relationship was and how they managed to keep themselves sustainable. But it goes back again to what you've just said. If cricket was being promoted for the sake of the game and not as a business, they probably wouldn't have found themselves in those particular situations based on their malpractice as a business rather than just as a game.
Look, one of the iron laws of business is that expenditure rises to meet income. The more money there is in the game, the more there will be spent, and the more incentive there will be for people to get involved. You actually earn a very tidy income in cricket administration these days. It's become quite a desirable career. You know, the last couple of chief executives of Cricket Australia, I don't know whether it's true for the interim holder of that office now, but we're paid like over $2 million a year. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money for selling something to people that they already love. And I don't know what the benchmarks were for the calculation of the bonuses that those executives were paid. I'd like to understand them a good deal better, so I had an opportunity to give them, you know, some sort of external scrutiny. But I'm not going to get that simply from asking. And if you look at the Cricket Australia annual report, it tells you sweet fall, and ICC even worse.
Yeah, I agree. I'm glad that I pushed you on it because, as you said, there aren't too many people in the world who deserve that much money in terms of a yearly income. And again, it goes back to the way that Cricket Australia has run in recent years and the struggles that it has. You know, as you said, you don't really need to look too far to work out where a few of the issues lie.
Well, it's a weak board. And that's the thing. They're not paid full-scale directors' fees. You know, they're paid honoraria. They continue to serve almost like the amateur administrators of the past on that board because of the prestige involved and the kind of that it's nice to be involved in cricket. It's nice to sit on the board of Cricket Australia. You get to sit at the cricket, you get free tickets, you get nice hotels, you're looked after. What's the incentive for really looking closely at the way in which the business is being run and how your executive is performing? What's the incentive to really rock the boat?
Well, that goes to something you said right at the top, about cricket having all of the hallmarks of business, but not
none of the obligations.
None of the obligations. And I think that's one of the things of looking at what a board is. Look at the ICC board and any of these boards. The board should be there to represent, the best interests of the entity as a whole. And if you're the ICC, that's the game of cricket.
Well, the ICC doesn't even elect its own board.
No, exactly. And then
it has to put up with some joker, the joker that such and such a country sends them.
Yeah.
What sort of organisation does that?
Well, exactly. And Australia did it to a degree with an independent board there for the game. And the talk now, I'm not sure how far that has got along about going back to a lot more state-based representation on there, seeing the states as stakeholders and the traditional owners, shall we say, of the game, of it coming together. I think that's one of the biggest issues in cricket is, on those boards that we say it's not the business or a business, but it's got to be run properly like one, and those directors need to be there looking out for the thing as a whole and not themselves. I think that's cricket's problem, because again, to the start, why do people get involved in people taking more out than they're putting in? That's the problem, isn't it? Having people there who are happy to put in and not take out.
Yeah.
And actually be there for the. But where do we find these people? Because are they not? It doesn't sound like they're being interviewed to go on any of these boards.
Well, it is a people business ultimately. It's because it's a game. It's about relationships. It's about community. And a wise Australian businessman of my acquaintance, Gary Pemberton, once said that the best way to get good corporate governance is to get good corporate governors. And I don't think we've got them. And I don't think we've got a system for engendering them at the moment. What Cricket Australia have ended up with is a pretty... Now, I was always told when they were spruiking the idea of an independent board that Cricket Australia would end up having a board festooned with captains of industry. That was the expression that was used. These were going to be genuine leaders, internationally respected figures. And in fact, what we've ended up with is a board that looks like a kind of a pretty standard listed mid-cap, which ultimately maybe is what Cricket Australia is, given the size of its revenues, but it doesn't have a lot of firepower in that boardroom. And I think that explains a lot about the executive discretion, the executive freedom, and the executive power that's grown up within the organisation. It can't be right in any organisation for a CEO to spend 17 years in the same job. James Sutherland, nice fella, did an okay job, but are you really meant to tell me that he was the best man, the only man capable of running Australian cricket for 17 years? Really? Well, that's a very disquieting confession for cricket to have to make, that the ranks of its executive talent are so thin, so shallow.
Well, yeah, you got maximum terms with directors, and you think if that top person isn't moving, then beneath them, the pressure that creates, if that glass ceiling is not going anywhere, then you lose a lot of good people if you don't have that progression through a company, do you? Especially then, then you heard the stories about that level below that festered, and that certain individuals were able to create their own little kingdoms. But, it's a tough one because, I look at it, the four of us sitting in Australia, so I don't want to get too Aussie-centric, but how important that, responsibility within the local game is, and how much can a Cricket Australia board do for your club, but how important the decisions made at that level do affect you, and to make sure that the right people voices are being heard. But it's a tough one. I don't know if we've worked out an answer yet.
Well, if you do, let me know. But I mean, to be fair, cricket administration as a large scale endeavour handling large amounts of money is a relatively new development. We're not talking about BHP here. This is something that's happened in the last generation, really. And we're kind of making up our own rules as we go along. And frankly, for a lot of the time, Australian cricket has got on perfectly well without the involvement of a top-down administration. My club's got nothing to do with Cricket Australia, never has had anything to do with it. We've got on and we've made our own culture, we've made our own teams, we've control their own facilities. We've taken steps to future-proof the organisation. We've taken steps to consolidate its past, to look after players from a welfare point of view. We haven't actually needed to be told how to do that by a centralised cricket authority. Perhaps we have unrealistic expectations at grassroots level of what the top level can do for us. We are good at finding practical solutions to short to medium term problems. That's an expertise that grows up inside clubs, and that's one that that I would like to think is indicative of a certain amount of kind of community cohesion. We've seen enormous changes in the level of cricket that I've played over the last 20 years. And it's done so without anyone standing there and telling us what to do. For one thing, pressure on councils to provide decent local infrastructure. That's a huge issue for clubs. Wasn't when I was growing up as a kid. That was simply taken for granted. But that's something that clubs have had to be mindful of. The revolution that's occurred in participation in Australian cricket because of the number of South Asians. You never saw anything but a white bread face in Australian cricket until 20 years ago. But now, I played against a team at the weekend. Was the team used to be National Bank, played in the Mercantile Cricket Association. It was the team put into the field by the bank. It was composed of bank officers. Now it was entirely South Asian, every single player, but it's still got the same name. Just everything else about it has changed, which I think is fantastic. But it's happened naturally. It's happened organically. It hasn't happened with anyone needing to tell us what to do. People are very good when you give them the freedom and the opportunity to make their own choices and to exercise discretion.
There's entire Nepali leagues now where it's basically just Sydney and Melbourne associations of just Nepali expats playing in one league against each other. That tells you everything that you need to know about, how far we've probably come along from a participation point of view.
And what's that got to do with Cricket Australia? Nothing. It's not as though they've gone out to expedite it. They'll become aware of it, I'm sure, and they'll want to take credit for it. But ultimately, it's people doing stuff for themselves. I mean, my club this year, we've been very historically quite dependent on English players. But of course, we can't have any English players this season. We usually get 6 or 7 good English guys coming over every summer to play for us. Can't get them this summer, but 4 Nepalese players turned up. 4 bloody good Nepalese players just turn up absolutely out of nowhere and can really play. That's just extraordinary and brilliant. And build it and they will come.
Well, and that's part of the thing with the boards who sort of take ownership of all the players in their country, and India always talks about the revenue coming out of India, like the BCCI owns every single eyeball, like some sort of feudal lord. But
yeah.
Cricket Australia doesn't own your league, and it's this thing where they think they own them, but they don't really.
Yeah.
I guess moving on to, you've talked a lot about the cultural and historical sort of side of cricket. One article that I remember reading was called The Stillbirth of the Ashes, which appears in a big sort of coffee table book about Australian cricket. And it poses a number of what-ifs and counterfactual sort of questions about Australian cricket history. And it got me thinking about some emerging cricket history. What if the ICC actually allowed the USA and Argentina in, back in the 1900s? Or what if Canada accepted Test status? Or even what if Dalmia and Marnie stayed around at the ICC a bit longer? Where do you think cricket might be if some of those junctures, as you talked about, went a bit differently?
Yeah, they're interesting. I mean, it was, I think I called it a counterfactual history of Australian cricket. What would have happened if someone had lost the toss rather than won it, if someone had gone on a particular tour. They're always kind of fascinating. The problem that cricket's had in expanding itself, a problem is obviously a manifestation of a great virtue, is that because Test cricket has been the preeminent form, the barriers to entry have always been very high. The challenges to new countries have always been very great. Perhaps had one-day cricket been a variant for longer, there would be more countries at the top level. Perhaps if one-day cricket had come into vogue immediately after the Second World War, there would have been opportunities for others to enter into global competition, because periods where associate countries have been strong have been relatively brief. You talk about Argentina there. It's a very good example of a country that was extremely strong at the turn of the century. That was partly an artifact of prosperity. Argentina, I think in the 1890s, was the wealthiest country per capita in the world. So it had a sizable leisure class. It had the opportunity. It was looking for amusements, and it aspired to a kind of an Anglo culture, to assimilating the Anglo culture, and cricket was one way to do that. But that opportunity was passed. Perhaps because it wasn't seized, but perhaps because it was temporary and it was invested in a particular generation of players was foregone. It's a bit difficult to conjure with those ideas because they're often artifacts of a particularly talented group of players coming together at the same time, and they're inherently perishable. Like Kenya in the 1990s. Kenya had a great opportunity to take that next step, didn't it? You know, very strong team, but ultimately the roots of the game weren't particularly deep, and they were, once that generation of players passed on, there was no one to inherit that mantle.
Well, the administration didn't help.
The administration very seldom helps. No, Dalmier's globalization, Dalmier is often identified with globalization. I never thought his model was particularly sophisticated. It really seemed to consist of kind of sticking plastic flags in a map and saying cricket is played here. You know, the greatest associate nation success story of our generation is Afghanistan. And it's not like the ICC did a brilliant job of promoting the game there. They did an okay job of recognising that the game had developed there, but the game occurred with amazing spontaneity and amazing naturalness. And out of an accident of kind of satellite television and demographics and refugees coming hither and yon and a lack of alternative games and early success, because early success is tremendously gratifying. That's one of the reasons why Australian cricket prospered, because we had early success. If Australia had lost against MCC in 1878, if it had lost every test match of the 19th century, there may not have been too many discouragements for cricket to come back from, but it certainly wouldn't have taken root in the Australian imagination to anything like the same degree. Early success against an estimable power with a context is just enormously valuable, provides tremendous impetus. That's why competition's so important and opportunity is so important. And its deprivation is such a backward step for these countries when they're trying to get their bottom foot on the rungs of the ladder.
Just to pick up on the Afghanistan story, and recently we've seen a test match between Australia and Afghanistan be, well, taken out of the schedule. I'm not sure what the official wording on that, whether it was postponed or otherwise, but between, you know, that fixture alone, but also if you want to add, and I'm not really big on adding too much in terms of external politics into it, but I think Australia at the moment probably has a moral obligation with Afghanistan at the moment, given the recent events and things like war crimes and stuff like that. Is it almost Cricket Australia's moral obligation to make sure that test match between Australia and Afghanistan actually goes on next year and promote the game and its emerging recent full member teams? Because I feel like Cricket Australia probably used perhaps the excuse of COVID not to hold it the first time, and now looking down the track at the potential of that just being thrown away. What are the chances of that test match actually happening on Australian shores?
Oh, look, I can remember arguing the first piece I probably wrote about Afghanistan in the paper in would have been probably 2012. I think I said something like Australia has a moral obligation to support cricket. It's where we've waged our longest war, for goodness sake. In some respects, it astounded me that cricket wasn't used in a more creative, diplomatic way to create some sort of common ground between the two countries. That seems to have been an opportunity that's gone completely begging. But I think, as you say, recent developments have sharpened and accentuated that moral obligation, which I think already existed. If we owe a country, if we owe any country anything, it's Afghanistan, frankly. But I think we probably owe Bangladesh.
Yeah,
I think Australian cricket's treated Bangladesh appallingly. We've used any opportunity going round to not play against them.
Yeah.
The fact that we haven't had them here since 2003, is that right?
Yeah.
top end series. Yeah,
We actually voted for them to become an ICC full member, and then we've just declined to play against them, or we've played against them in the most grudging fashion possible.
Well, we lost to them when we were over there as well.
Yeah,
maybe that's why.
maybe. Well, 2015, after we got our asses handed to us in the Ashes and David Warner had a broken hand, I thought we were pretty vulnerable to losing a series over there. I think Cameron Bancroft had come into the side instead of Warner. That shows how desperate we were. So that's a counterfactual.
Mm-hmm.
If Australia had toured Bangladesh in 2015, what might have happened?
I mean, I know this is not very charitable, but I think Bangladesh got bought off with a vote for the Big Three reforms with a promise of a tour. So I guess it's sort of they're just desserts, really, in my opinion. If you're selling your vote with some crooks, well, then the crooks turn on you and rip you off. Well, don't feel too aggrieved. I don't know. That's kind of.
Well, I would love to have had a laundry list of all the promises made in 2014, around about the time of the big three. Boy, oh boy, it would have been the sun, the moon, the stars, wouldn't it?
Yeah. We have a couple of questions from some of our emerging cricket friends. We have Shonak, who asks how you came to cricket journalism. I know we've all seen a letter circulated on social media that you're not a part of, that you wrote when you were in high school.
Yeah.
So it's obviously cricket writing's always been part of your makeup.
Yeah, and I guess a contrarian streak too, because I was arguing for the supremacy of the precedence of Victor Trumper over Donald Bradman. Always prepared to take an agnostic position. Look, I like I said, I was a business journalist. I got a job in journalism out of school. I got sent to the business section. I certainly had no ambitions to become a business journalist. And I didn't really feel particularly strongly about journalism one way or the other. It was simply a way of earning a living and not going to university. So it fulfilled both those criteria. And you don't need much background to be a journalist. Anyone can do it, frankly. A half smart person can work out how to do journalism in 6 weeks. Getting good at it, that's different. But learning the basics of it, it's pretty elementary. I started writing about cricket when I went to England in 1990. I went over to become a business stringer for the finance sections of the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. And while I was there, I started watching cricket. I liked cricket. I was, without wanting to sound kind of arrogant about it, I wasn't completely happy about the way in which people were writing about it. I thought, well, I can either sit around and complain about this, or I can have a go myself and see how it's done, whether I can contribute anything. So I started doing that. I got back to Australia and I thought, I should write a book. I should write a cricket book. Okay, what am I going to do? It was the 15th anniversary of World Series cricket. And World Series cricket had been an important part of my falling in love with the game. There was a heady moment when there was cricket on 2 channels on TV rather than 1. So I thought it'd be interesting to go back and revisit that period, both in order to find out what happened and to compare it to how I remember it as a school child. And it was a great experience to do that book because it gave me a kind of an introduction to cricket history. It gave me an introduction to cricketers and gave me a good sense of how you talk to a cricketer, how you relate to a cricketer. It gave me an interesting sense of how different cricketers' experience of cricket is to the experience of watchers and to the long gaze of history. And it was an interesting challenge to reconcile the 3 of those between covers. And I think after that, I kind of just thought I'd see how far I could go with it. People seemed to keep asking for me to write about it, and I hadn't got bored with it. I hadn't got completely bored with it. I'm not bored with it now. I'm actually quite excited about it. I'm really excited about a test series, always excited about a test series. So I've kind of, my enthusiasm for the game has been maintained, perhaps partly because I've been capable of going away from it from periods of time and returning refreshed. And because there's something interesting and fun and challenging about trying to describe something that you've seen countless times before, trying to find a new way to describe an old sensation or an old technique or an old experience.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. And to impart that enthusiasm to readers, because readers have a very strong sense of when you're just going through the motions. They're very quick to call you on it, and they want something from journalism now that they couldn't simply work out themselves. Television's the great challenge for print journalism, because everyone thinks they know what's happened already. Everyone's seen it. Everyone knows the score. Everyone's had a good look at the first draft of history, which has been imparted by the commentators. You're there to provide the second and third drafts. You're there to provide the context. You're there to provide the resonances. You're there to broaden perspectives. And if you're a writer, that's a great challenge. So, I keep going back to cricket journalism because it's a great challenge, not because I think I've mastered it, but because I feel as though I can get a little bit better at it with each passing year. I hope I do. Anyway, if I've ever felt that I couldn't do that, I'd stop doing it.
And the second crowd question was from Nate, and he noticed on your website that you listed the band Big Black among your things that you like.
Great band.
And his question was, does that have anything to do with Steve Albini's ethics as a musician and a producer, or just the sound of the band? Now, for context, and I had to read this context as well from Nate, Albini doesn't take royalties from any album he produces, which Nate believes ties in with journalists trying to tell a story.
I do like Steve Albini. I do. Look, Steve Albini, yeah, love the bands, love the sound, the Albini sound. Big Black, absolutely obsessed with them, frankly. One of my numerous obsessions, Atomizer and songs about and Racer X, and just great records. And even some of the subsequent things that he's done, like Rape Man, and the records that he's produced. It's a bit of a stamp of quality. And I like the way he just calls it as he sees it, Steve Albini. He's a genuine kind of insider-outsider, and that's a kind of a good status to it to be. He loves what he does, and he does it for the right reasons, and he makes great music, and just can't ask for any more of a musician. Yeah, so Big Black, yeah, outstanding. Mark E. Smith from The Fall, David Thomas from Perubu, PJ Harvey, Ed Cooper. We could have another hour and a half podcast. Me talking about music. Actually, when I work with Peter Lawler and I spend an awful lot of time talking about music. Probably more time talking about music than we do about cricket.
How do you feel about Vanessa Williams?
How do I feel about Vanessa Williams? Yeah, look, that's. Yeah, let's talk about that off air. Okay?
Saving the best for last.
I may have sung a couple of weeks ago that Nick lovingly cut in some Vanessa Williams, and that's where I got onto 90s movies and Arnold Schwarzenegger. But that's another, as you say, another podcast.
We're going to put you on the spot here, Gideon. If you could change one law in the sport of cricket, what would it be and why?
Well, I do. I mean, I've said this before. I think the taboo around mancads is absurd. Oh, actually, they've kind of remedied this law in a way, but I would like to remove the kind of the slightly obsessive and puritanical attitude to mancads. We had a mancad in a club game a couple of weeks ago, and I saw absolutely nothing wrong with it. And frankly, nor did any of the players on either side. I think the mancad is a bit of it's remained a sort of a media staple because it generates debates that offer more heat than light, and the media kind of loves that. And it's an inherently kind of unanswerable question, but I don't think it does the game any good. And actually, it's a kind of a phony controversy. And I hate phony controversies. There are big issues to be discussed in cricket, and mancads they're just not one of them.
Yep.
Man of our heart.
Yeah, no arguments here. Yeah. I think
it's
look,
unanimous that
there may have been a slight journey to get there, but I think you're talking to a room of converts there. That over time, some the hard way. But I was mancading kids when I was in short pants, so I've been.
God.
I don't know what that says about me, but.
It's funny, the mancad that took place at my club game, the guy was like 2 meters out. He was 2 meters out, and we gave him a bloody warning, and he just chose to ignore the warning. And the bowler concerned was the angriest man at my club, Fiery, as we know him. He sledges his own teammates more than he does the opposition. But when he warned the guy, I said, "What are you doing, Fiery? You of all people shouldn't be bloody warning him. Just run him out." And he goes, yeah, I'm going to do that. And he did it. And wait, afterwards, he felt really cleansed, like he'd kind of got over this. It had been quite cathartic for him.
He'll never warn again.
Yeah, exactly.
If only the rest of the cricketing community had that
one experience. Yeah.
That's the one that would truly convert everyone. But yeah, as Tim said, I think we're all well and truly in the pro mancad boat. Maybe not on what it's actually called, but the principle of it, I think.
Oh, exactly. Shouldn't have been called a mancad.
I guess you could say it could have been called a Brown, couldn't it? Because he was the victim. So
could have been called an Armstrong. Because I think the first man to attempt a mancad in Australian cricket was Warwick Armstrong back in the Sheffield Shield game in 1915.
Oh,
he attempted it, and Armstrong, tough as nails, pushed the boundaries all the time. The archetypal Australian cricketer. I wrote a book about him. I should know.
Funny you should mention Armstrong. One of the little notes I had was that I sort of see Tim as a reincarnation of Warwick Armstrong in his. Both physically and some of the way he looks at the game and the way he plays it. So that's quite funny that you mentioned that.
Yeah, well,
it's been a pleasure to have you on, Gideon. Thank you so much for joining the Emerging Cricket Podcast. As three lovers of your work, it's been great to have you on, and I'm sure the emerging cricket community feel the same way. Thanks for joining the Emerging Cricket Pod.
Pleasure was all mine. Thanks for having me, gentlemen.
A huge thank you again to Gideon Haigh for joining us on the show. Make sure to subscribe to the Emerging Cricket Podcast if you haven't done so already, so you can tune in as soon as it drops every week. Pass the pod around and make sure to give us a 5-star review. If you want to support us financially, go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/Emerging Cricket, where you can support us from as little as $2 US a month. You'll get access to extended cuts of a number of our shows, and you'll also have a say on the show's direction. For now, on behalf of Nick Skinner, Tim Culler, and myself, Daniel Beswick, see you next week.